So today we're going to talk about where I think the meta is going. Not where it is, not where it was, but where it's going. And the underlying fundamental truth of this video is the idea that metas get warped around whatever the strongest thing to do in the game is. We've seen this before, for instance, during the Chamber meta. Chamber was the strongest agent in the game, and the meta warped around him. For instance, during that time, we of course saw a lot less Jet than we did, and we saw a lot more Raze, because of course you didn't need a Jet op because your Chamber would be opping instead. That would be an example. Or another one would be that we saw a lot of double Initiator during that time as well, to try and, one, find the Chamber and where that Chamber was playing, and then be able to push off that Chamber. Agents like Fade, Breach, KO were all trying to do that to make sure you weren't getting punished by the opposition Chamber as well. And so today I wanted to talk about where we are now in the meta, this kind of double controller meta that we've been living in, for about the past year, but I don't think it's fully warped around those ideas, but I think slowly but surely we're getting there. And that's because the strongest thing in the game right now, to me, and I've mentioned this many times, is of course Viper. And we've already seen some of this, maybe the more obvious points of warping happen, right? Where we are playing a lot of double controller with Viper on a lot of these maps, and slowly but surely now we're getting to the point where, I think even Haven will start to become a Viper map primarily as well. And then basically we'll only be left with Ascent as the one kind of holdout map. But I think even then we might start to see some more experimentation. And we have already seen some experimentation on Ascent as well with Viper. And I think that that will continue so long as things don't change. And as I said, we've already seen some of those more obvious changes come in. Things like Skye being played a lot as the Initiator in those double controller comps. Skye is kind of the facilitator of it all, I think. If you did like nerf Skye very heavily, that would have an impact on how much double control you would see. Viper would still be very strong, of course, but Skye is kind of the thing that allows it to be meta on pretty much every map as well. But as I said, I don't think that we're fully there. I think there are still some things that haven't quite happened yet. And a good example of this was my video on Killjoy on Haven. That when you are playing against a Viper or with a Viper with Killjoy on Haven, some of those normal setups that you do as a Killjoy on that map just don't quite work as well. Or, there's certain setups that Killjoy is then forced to do that maybe aren't the most efficient way of playing Killjoy either. And so that's the idea of this video, to explore those kind of ideas of, what agents are being underpicked and maybe we can expect to see be picked more because of the meta we're currently in. And let's start with the Sentinels. And I just talked about Killjoy on Haven, but I do think that that is more of a one-off kind of the way that Viper affects that map kind of case, rather than Killjoy doesn't have the synergy, in with double controller or anything like that. Killjoy is still very strong and, is still going to be played on a lot of maps, and I think that that is more of a Haven specific thing. However, I do think that the other two Sentinels, or main Sentinels in Chamber and Cypher, are being underplayed, right? Obviously, we've just got the Cypher buff, so you might expect more Cypher simply because of that anyway, because he received a significant buff. But also, Cypher does have things that work pretty well in this meta, right? Especially now that things like Skydogs can't destroy those trips as easily. Trips don't care about smokes. A turret does. The alarm bot can be smoked off, but Cypher trips can't. Right, Cypher trips don't care about that, and so that is an advantage if we are playing in this double controller meta. The same thing could be said for Chamber as well, where with this Viper wall that comes down on Haven, for an example here, it's very hard for the defenders to actually get past this, right, to get on the other side of the wall and get ahead of it, but Chamber maybe can, right? Chamber with a setup something like this maybe feels like, yeah, I can be, a bit more aggressive in getting ahead of this and trying to play ahead of this kind of Viper wall. And so maybe there is some things that Chamber could do on some of these maps as well. Now let's move on to the controllers, and I think there's one big glaring thing for me when it comes to the controllers, and that is the overvalue of Omen on some of these maps. And the reason really all has to do with the one-ways. Of course, Omen, one of the big advantages he has over some of the other controllers is the fact that he can one-way a lot of spots. But against double controller, in some instances, that doesn't really mean anything, because for instance, on Lotus especially, this one drives me absolutely crazy that people are still doing that Omen one way towards A with Omen on the defensive side, but the attackers with most of the Viper walls that you will see can just walk past that one way anyway, and it becomes something that doesn't really exist and isn't really a one-way, and you're just wasting a smoke. And this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. The pro teams, I don't think we fully got to where this meta is going yet. I still think there's room to be explored, because I think if people did really think about it, they'd realize that that one-way is just a waste of a smoke. And so for me, if you are playing on a map where a big reason why you've picked Omen is because I want to do one-ways, well, against a team who knows what they're doing with double controller, that shouldn't really be an issue for them, and it's probably not the reason that you should be picking Omen. Again, this isn't to say that Omen should be down in the dumps and not getting picked at all. He still has value outside of the one-ways, but if that's a large reason why you are picking Omen, then I don't think it's a very good idea. And now let's come to the Initiators, and obviously the Initiator class right now is being dominated by Skye, and in a double controller meta, that will probably stay the same. I don't really see any other way it would leave, but there are other instances. I think if you are playing like on a map, for instance, with no Sentinel or no Duelist, you might open up another Initiator slot, for instance, on a map like Bind. And in those situations, I think that there are times when agents like Fade can really shine, right? When you are playing a Viper and you're kind of slicing up the map into smaller chunks, that means that your Fade Prowlers are probably going to check everything that they need to, and having two Prowlers at that point becomes very, very valuable to you, because then you can check, is anyone ahead of my Viper setup? If the answer is no, then sure, this is great. We can put up our Viper setup and create a lot of pressure in certain instances. We saw Fancy United doing this a lot on their Ascent with a Viper and a Fade that I really, really liked and thought it was a really, really nice idea. But there are other Initiators as well who we've seen struggle, and I think, again, if we adapt to this Vibe meta, they will continue to struggle. And the most notable example is definitely Breach. Breach flashes against double controller just aren't great, because even some of the time they just won't affect you whatsoever, right? A smoke will be up in its place, and the flash that you're hoping will have a big impact will have literally zero impact instead. And also for his stun and his ult, because of all those smokes potentially going up, right? If you've got 4 controllers on a map, that's a lot of potential smokes to have to deal with. Even if you do catch someone with those abilities, you know, you might not even be able to actually find them and see where they are to actually then punish them. They might be able to be hiding behind their smokes long enough to where they can survive and then punish you. But then finally, let's come to the Duelist class, because of course the Duelist class for the longest time has been dominated by Jett and Raze. And really, you might say that there isn't any way that that's truly going to change, right? As long as the agents stay the same, that will probably continue to be the case. And that's true. But there is one duelist who I do think within this meta probably isn't seeing as much play as they should be right now, and that's Yoru. And we have actually seen certain teams start to move in this direction. We of course have seen Sentinels play Yoru on Bind and find a lot of success with it. But we've also started to see teams like Cloud9 play it on Sunset and also find a lot of success with it. And we've seen certain teams play it on maps like Breeze as well. Teams like, Shopify, the old version 1 Game Changers team. And again, this makes sense to me in a double controller meta for a couple reasons. One is the flash that Yoru has. Of course, flashing through a Viper wall or pop flashing through a smoke is good. And Yoru has 2 flashes, so that's good. Another thing is that when you are TPing in onto the site as a Yoru, that can often be very, very risky, right? In terms of you have to go in, it makes a loud noise, everyone looks at you, you die from very, very far away, right? But when you're playing with double controller, that's actually less likely to happen because, again, the map is more segmented up into little sections, right? When you've got a Viper smoke that's going across a site and you TP into it, there's just less angles that the opponents can be that actually see you TP to that point, right? And also, you could argue that when you fake that as well, it becomes more effective because, again, if it's more segmented up, they're not going to know, is that fake or is it real, because the smoke's in the way. And then finally, the same thing that was true for Chamber is true for Yoru as well, where you might feel that you can be more aggressive coming down into these spots ahead of some of these opposing Viper setups if you wanted to, if you have a gate crash to TP out elsewhere, right? If this is what you've got, you can be more aggressive with Yoru than you could be with a Jett or a Raze, or maybe even any other agent and actually get ahead of some of these Viper setups. And so this was really just to say that I feel like in the meta we're in right now, there's still some ideas yet to be explored. There's still some things where I think we can push this a bit further before we reach the meta's end of double controller, right? Now, I don't know if Viper and Skye will change anytime soon. If they do, then this whole video doesn't really matter. But if it doesn't, and we do still end up in a double controller meta, then these kind of ideas I think you can start to explore, and we have seen some teams start to explore some of these ideas, as I mentioned, with things like Yoru.